Thank you to Red Eye, the Photography Network, for partnering with us to produce Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. Red Eye is a not-for-profit organization with a strong ethical focus, offering support and opportunities to help you advance your photography and your career. Find out more at redeye.org.uk. Welcome to Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 2, we'll be talking with Alex Reynolds about taking a step back. Alex Reynolds is an American travel photographer, writer, and solo female backpacker whose work has been featured on Lonely Planet, BBC Travel, AP News, and more. She's scrambled up fortress ruins in Afghanistan, watched gods dance in South India, galloped horses across the Kyrgyz steppe, and motorbiked all over Pakistan. She blogs at Lost with Purpose to encourage more responsible travel as others do the same. I was wondering if we could start by you just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So, hi everyone who's listening. I'm Alex. I'm a 30-year-old photographer and traveler and blogger and lots of other ers from the United States. And what I do can be a complicated question, but basically for the last 5 years pre-pandemic, I was just kind of traveling around the world, primarily in Asia. Basically, I did photography. I did a lot of travel blogging and the influencer jam. I've also done travel writing. I've done other random freelance things. I've guided tours. I'm currently working with a sustainable tourism startup sort of organization, just all kinds of things, but also photography. So there.
No, that's brilliant. And I was really excited to have you on the podcast because I think a lot of times we're speaking specifically with people who may be like professional, like full-time photojournalists or, other people maybe quite enmeshed in the photography industry. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that your work sort of sits slightly outside of it and is a little bit more sort of part of that popular culture of Instagram and travel photography. And I think that is something that we often don't talk about, but that definitely it plays a role in photography ethics. So I was really glad to have you on here because, I think it's important that we expand what we're talking about when we're talking about photography ethics beyond sort of the traditional professional industry views. And I'd seen that you had posted a little bit about especially like colonialism in like travel industry and colonialism in travel photography and sort of the echoes of that. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how are you approaching photography ethics in your work and what does that mean to you for your area?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I wasn't thinking about it at the start. I was just trying to jump on the influencer bandwagon and sustain myself through travel, like many people. And then it kind of evolved. The more you travel, the more you're exposed to different ways of representing your travel. And especially because I'm out on the internet, basically just whoring myself out to my followers all the time, it forces you to kind of reflect a lot on how you present both yourself and the destinations you're visiting, and what sells also is always a consideration. And so with time, I started to realize that, people often just center themselves and just kind of take other people and use them as props a lot in my industry and just are trying to craft the visuals that we are expecting to see in a sales pitch about insert destination here. The way that people are doing that a lot of the times didn't seem very authentic to the situations that are actually happening on the ground. A lot of the time, it seemed very exploitative when it came to using people or places sometimes for promotion like this. And as external people, not myself, people introduced me to the discussions about Orientalism, both in photography and otherwise, and the effects of colonialism on travel. And I got to reading about all of this and realized that oh shit, I'm also guilty of plenty of these things. And because I'm at this interesting intersection that you alluded to of kind of like a professional industry that is also forward facing and interacts a lot with the customers or just the average traveler, I'm at a really interesting intersection where I could actually influence how people think about these difficult topics. And I also need to be the role model for these people. And so once I realized that I could have that responsibility, I do have that responsibility, I realized I needed to start being a lot more cautious in just the way that I present places to people, the way that I interact with these places when I'm doing my own photography or sometimes videography and writing. And yeah, now I'm hyper aware of way too many things, and it makes it very complicated and interesting, as I'm sure that many of you have figured out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like what kinds of things maybe specifically have you been changing about, your practice as a photographer in particular when you're going to different places?
I think that the most important thing I've started to do is to stop taking pictures of people up close, like within I don't know, maybe 3 meter radius. I've stopped taking people's pictures until I've started interacting with them. And that was a really big shift for me just because, yeah, I mean, we go around, we take photos of people, we hope that they don't notice, and then we kind of slither off. And one, I mean, as many of you probably know, that never yields a particularly powerful photo short of the like stark, miserable Nat Geo kind of poverty porn vibe that we should not be aspiring to. And secondly, it produced much better photos once I started trying to build a rapport with people. And once I removed that awkward interaction of like freaky outsider with camera coming in and invading someone's space and trying to extract pictures from their existence before they even said hello. And so it's been interesting because I take a lot less photos now, but I also think that the photos that I do get of people or places are much more candid and relaxed as a result. But it's also interesting because I try to explain this to other people and then they resist because they're going to miss the Nat Geo shot, quote unquote. And so this is actually one of the things that I think is the most powerful in regards to approaching photography with a more ethical eye, but also one of the things that people resist the most.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what you said is something that resonates so much with me about like when you do have authentic interactions with people, the resulting images, you can tell that you're getting something more. You're learning something more about people from those photographs that are produced in a context of a conversation than those sort of, photographs that I think you said earlier, reduce people just to props. And I think that resonates a lot with me. So this obviously was quite a process for you. Like you said, this isn't where you started. This is where you've come to. And you sort of alluded to some things that were resources that were useful for you along the way. Could you talk a little bit more about how did you make that transition and what resources did you rely on for that?
So I can actually pinpoint the point where I started thinking about these things. There is a podcast called Sacred Footsteps. It's run by a small group of Muslim travelers, and they had me on the show because I've traveled a lot in countries that they're familiar with, presumably Pakistan. And they had me on as an example to just discuss kind of ethical influencing. They said I was a good example. Thank God. And so they touch a lot on the issues of Orientalism. And so I had literally no idea what that meant when they referenced me as an example and eventually had me on another one of their podcasts. And so I got reading, and it basically put an ism to things that I had started to notice already, just in how things are represented in travel media. And so obviously, as things go, I started a deep dive into just how colonialism and Orientalism manifest in travel imagery and travel writing and just the things that I had close proximity to. And I began to reflect on my past work, on my existing work, and pick out the things that I clearly was playing into all of these tropes. Like, for example, always looking for poverty in the streets, always representing places as kind of chaotic, colorful, bustling, these kinds of generic cliches. And it really was a matter of seeing that recognizing that, being extremely uncomfortable about the fact that I too am promoting these kinds of images, and then wondering, how do I not do that? And I'm definitely not past this point of figuring out how to not do that. It's been 2 or 3 years now since, no, probably more, maybe like 5 years since this kind of reckoning occurred. And 100%, I still catch myself falling into these tropes and photographing these kinds of scenes just because it's there, it's ingrained into our minds, and we can't help but want to capture that image and then go back and wonder what the heck we were doing. And so I think, to play into what I said earlier, the challenging myself to not take photos of people before I have an interaction with them also gives me this time and space to reflect on the scene and reflect on the situation and really think, is this what I want to be showing? Do I want to be showing it this way? Or am I just playing into tropes? And then I can think about that as I'm having this conversation or interacting with these people and establishing myself in their space in whatever capacity I'm there. And then once I feel comfortable and once they feel comfortable, we have a better understanding of each other. We have a better understanding of the situation. And I have time to move beyond the instinctive, like, oh, poor people in the street, click, click, click. That's typical to so many travel photographers in the regions I've been traveling in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what you're describing sounds like something that a few of the other podcast guests in previous seasons have mentioned as well, is the importance of taking time, and how a lot of times, I really appreciate what you said, that a lot of times, you know, your maybe gut instinct or gut reaction is to maybe reproduce a lot of these tropes that we expect or that we think of as good photography. But it's through time and through reflection that you work through that and move beyond it. And I think that element of time is something that can be quite a slippery thing, because I think people don't necessarily want to take that time or to spend more time.
I mean,
do you think time, does that resonate? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the issues with time is that, I mean, people listening to this can empathize, is that we don't always have a lot of time. And this kind of plays into another thing that I've been kind of grappling with and coming to terms with, is that sometimes you don't have enough time in a situation to accurately portray it in your photography. And then I think an important question that a lot of us photographers at any level need to be asking ourselves is, are we then suitable to be representing this in our photos? Because, I mean, parachute journalism is a thing. In my own industry, people drop into a place and take photos of it for 2 seconds and then leave and deem themselves experts. That's what we do all the time. And I think one of the hardest reckoning points that we all have to deal with now is really taking that step back and wondering if we should be promoting these photos at all, if we should be the ones in that situation. And what's been hard for me is that I realize I am not that person who should be there taking those photos and representing this place through imagery. A lot of the times it is someone from that region or someone who's better suited or better acquainted with the situation than I am. And so that's been one of the biggest changes in my own professional work in the last few years, is to learn to say no, just because I realize that most of the time I'm not the right person. And it's been a big change. I used to dream of being, you know, the Nat Geo photographer. Just, it doesn't have to be Nat Geo, some big fancy travel photographer who goes around the world and discovers ancient cultures and takes these photos and blah, blah, blah. And I realized it's not really that ethical for me to just drop into these places and, as some clueless foreign outsider, take these photos and tell people's stories in the span of just a few days. And so one of the biggest steps I've had in the last few years is learning to say no. I started to say no to different kinds of assignments and put my camera away in situations where it's not appropriate, just because sometimes it's not our story to tell. And so time definitely plays into it. Time is the first considering factor, just to loop back to what you said. If we don't have enough time, maybe that's not how we should be using our time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something there as well that made me think about, you know, I think that there's like a 2-step process a lot of times. Well, there is, obviously, that happens, especially with like social media, that when people are traveling, they're taking photographs and they're in the heat of the moment and they're enjoying themselves. And maybe that's not the moment that they're being super reflexive about, what am I photographing? How am I representing this? But it's almost that next step of, okay, I've taken the photograph, but now I'm sharing that photograph. That's almost where I think a lot of times things get even more potentially problematic, because that's when you're representing a place to others who've not been there. Does that resonate?
100%. I mean, we're all taking photos constantly while we're traveling, but whether we're just a casual traveler or an influencer like myself, what we choose to share has such a huge impact on how people perceive both what we're sharing and just the place that we're sharing about. And so, like what I was saying before, there's also an element of looking at the photo and wondering if it's appropriate to share. And even if it's the best photo with the best lighting and such a powerful look from whatever person, or everything's composed perfectly, sometimes we have to take that step back and say, no, this isn't appropriate for whatever reason. For example, I have this shot that I took while I was traveling around in Bangladesh, and it could tick all of the check boxes for stereotypical kind of poverty imagery. I was like outside someone's house. It was made out of mud and bamboo. There were a bunch of kids playing. They were hilarious little kids. They had like pots, and one of the kids was like carrying his brother naked in a pot. And it was just so absurd. It's like, okay, I want this photo because this is hilarious and brilliant. And the photo's really lovely. There's all this energy. People are moving. Kids are playing. It's very colorful because of all their clothes. There's a tiny child in a pot having a grand old time, but just, I've never shared it because at some point you realize that this is not appropriate to be sharing. There's naked children. These children, like their parents didn't give me permission to share this photo. This is just promoting the idea of like Bangladeshi people as being poor and backwards, and just, this isn't right and I shouldn't be sharing it. And so even though I go back to look at that photo all the time and it brings a smile to my face every time, I'm not going to share it. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with in our culture, where everyone is constantly sharing everything all the time because that's what you have to do. Sometimes we do have to step back and just decide that, no, this is not appropriate. And that is definitely a very important step of the two-part process that people don't think about enough.
I feel like that's like particularly powerful to hear coming from you working as an influencer, that like that's your job, is to go and share things, and for you to say, to adopt that ethical stance, I think is really important, and hopefully others can learn from your example. And sort of on that note, you were talking about how you decided to use your platform to promote a lot of this thinking. And how have you found that? And how are you doing that? And how are people taking to it? How have you found that experience?
Well, like everything on the internet, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Some people love you for it, and some people shout at you for being on a soapbox too often. And so the haters aside, generally people have been quite receptive. What's interesting that I found, and hopefully this will help other people who might be in a similar position, is that a lot of people are interested in learning about these things, and they are interested in making more ethical decisions and being more ethical on their travels or otherwise. But the issue is that they just don't understand how. They don't have the examples to guide them and show them this is how you would actually respond in this situation. Because some of the things are very clear and basic, like don't take pictures of kids unless their parents give you permission, and like don't post naked people unless you really have to, which you don't really have to ever. So backtrack. Don't post pictures of naked people unless they give you their consent. But a lot of other things are much more subjective. And so we as photographers, and presumably a lot of you listening now are also photographers, we have a better understanding of different kinds of situations and the nuances of photos. But the average person might not have that. They're just looking at a scene and being like, click, my iPhone says this looks good, so I will take it. And so they don't understand the nuances between showing like something in a negative light versus a positive light, and how just a little bit of lighting or color change can affect that. They don't necessarily understand the difference between like someone looking powerful and confident in a portrait versus looking scared or invaded. And so a lot of people are interested to learn these things, but they need more tangible examples to help them actually grasp visually what these suggestions are all about. And so one of the things that I found powerful in my own kind of discussion of these ideas is to have actual like side by side examples of these different concepts so that people can have an, okay, this is good, this is bad. And I know that it's not always so black and white, but at least just to give people a little bit of context into what they're actually trying to achieve, I think is really important. And so that's been really effective for me. And people have been responsive when I've brought these things up.
Absolutely. And, I think that a lot of times it seems like people replicate the things that they think make a good photograph. And, I think what you're saying, people might not understand the nuances of visual language. I do think people know how photographs make them feel. And I think maybe if we tap into that a little bit more and like you're saying, show those side by side examples and show people how these photographs are communicating differently. I think that's such a great way of doing that. And as well, if more and more professional photographers and more of the photographs that people are consuming are more sensitive in their visual language, hopefully there will also be a trickle down in that way.
I'd like to hope so. We'll see. I mean, it's definitely framing it as how photographs make you feel or how you would feel if you're in the photograph. I'm sure you must have talked about that at some point on the podcast. It is really powerful to an extent. But it's also something I've seen while working as a tour guide and trying to kind of subtly control people to not invade other people's space. You'd be surprised how frequently people don't really have that context flip of, if someone were doing this to me, would I be uncomfortable? Sometimes you have to remind people quite often. And then just the remnants of colonial thinking. Actually, colonialism is not over. Correction, just colonial thinking does make a lot of people feel entitled to take a certain kind of photo just because they paid to be there. This is what's been done. This is always done. And that's just fine in these kinds of countries. And so that's where I think the responsibility falls on to the professionals at whatever level to be more conscious in what they share and what they promote, because they are creating the ideal that these people are aspiring to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That would be a really interesting, but also difficult conversation to have with people, especially when you're there as a guide and people are maybe doing things that make you uncomfortable. How do you handle that? Because I'm sure lots of photographers have found themselves in similar situations with colleagues.
Yeah, I'm still learning how to navigate that because obviously on the one hand, the customer is king and I can only upset guests so much, and no one is paying to come on a tour and have someone just shove ethics down their throats, which I could very easily do, but I must resist. But generally, like I said, I try to frame it. And how would you feel if it was like this? I ask them politely, if you could, please don't take photos of these children, or please don't take photos of this. I model it myself because I carry a camera around, and some people notice that I stopped taking pictures at a certain point, and that resonates with some people. And then actually one thing that comes to mind on one of my last trips that I guided, one of the clients had a really massive camera with a long lens. He had a good telephoto on it. And he was making me uncomfortable because he was taking a lot of photos of children, and I didn't quite know how to tell him in a way that he would understand that maybe he should ease up on that. My business partner actually had a much better way of approaching it. She asked him, what is that camera lens for? It's really big. He's like, what are you shooting with that? It's what do you use that for? And he's like, oh, people use it to shoot wildlife and stuff like this. And she said, oh, so you think humans are just animals then? And he was like, oh. And then he slowed down on all of the invasive people portraits after that. So that was helpful. But yeah, I mean, every guest is different. Some people are resistant. Some people just don't know. And so approach kind of varies depending on the person.
Absolutely. I think I would really struggle to keep my mouth closed.
It's really hard.
If I was in your position.
It's really hard. Sometimes I'm bold, and then some people really just don't get it after a few encounters. And then that's when I just kind of wonder what I'm doing and have these kind of moral conundrums and freakouts in my head. And then sometimes I let them go. Sometimes I keep trying, but just at some point, I also have to cater to all of their needs and make them happy. And some people just don't like having serious conversations on vacation.
Yeah. How do you reconcile that point that you made earlier about, maybe not being well placed or not being the right person to be photographing something, and sort of countering the sort of parachute journalism tradition. How do you reconcile that in travel photography? Because it's quite conflicting, I can imagine.
Absolutely. So the way that I reconcile this is that both in photography and writing, actually, I do think that there is a value to having a traveler represent a place, because travel media is taking a destination and presenting it to people who don't know anything about it or have very limited understanding of it. And so, in a lot of instances, having a traveler's eye for these locations would actually be more beneficial than having a local who might not have the same interests that a traveler would have. And to be fair, part of those interests have been crafted throughout the decades by this like very stereotypical travel media. But simultaneously, it's true that when you go to a place, you're going to have a very shallow experience with it. You're only going to see a certain set of things. And so it can be useful to have someone with that like novelty in their eye come in and represent this place. And so when I accept assignments or just when I'm doing my own work, at this point, whenever someone asks me to do something, I take a step back and ask if I would be of value, of actual value to this project. So if it's something much deeper than travel, like for example, I've been asked to do photography or videography in regards to more like sensitive social subjects in countries that I'm not well affiliated with or don't know very well or don't speak the language or whatever. But I personally know that I cannot add that depth to the conversation that is necessary. But for something like travel, where it's just, hey, we have this beautiful place and we want to have these kinds of people show up and have this kind of interaction with it, that's something that I know because I am that person. I am that traveler. And so I can represent it to other travelers. So in that way, I do think that it's very reasonable to have outsiders come in for travel media related purposes. But anything that goes deeper than that, I'm kind of wary of at this point. Sorry to any journalists listening to this and feeling guilty about that. But yeah, I feel like travel is basically at the boundary where I feel comfortable kind of representing a place in photography. And once you move past travel media, then it starts to become much more questionable.
No, that makes complete sense. And something that I think is quite interesting is maybe thinking about accuracy in travel photography, because I can imagine that like there are quite a lot of situations where travel photographs could disappoint people when they show up at the place and it's not maybe quite as pristine a beach or quite as dramatic a landscape as they had hoped. Is that something that you address at all, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, in my own influencing, I definitely aspire to be as authentic, dangerous word, but I try to be more nuanced with my representation of a place than maybe the most basic kinds of travel media. I try to show both the beautiful and sometimes the ugly, preferably in a slightly more like veering towards beautiful a little bit more. I try to show both the good and the bad, but in an equal balance, or at least veering towards good. I'm not trying to just rain misery upon a destination. But I know that as an influencer who controls all of her social media and has that kind of leeway to choose what I put on a blog or put on my Instagram feed, I know that I have more space for nuance and complexity than perhaps the average photographer just shooting something basic for a tourism board might have. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to address kind of authenticity in photography, whether it be including more elements than maybe a basic fine art photo would include. If it's about including a broader range of photos in a series that you share, if it's maybe accompanying pictures with a certain kind of wording to just explain that there is a little bit more depth beyond what you're showing. There's a lot of different ways that we can do it. But I do think that it's something that more people need to aspire to, just because you also don't want people to feel let down by your work either, right? It's not a good feeling to know that you're essentially like visually lying to someone about what a place is like. Or maybe that's just me, but I feel bad if I'm misrepresenting a place to people. And so I think it's important to set expectations also, just because otherwise you're going to be feeding into this culture where people are just posting like impossible images and encouraging other people to seek out something that doesn't actually exist. And that kind of toxic, vicious cycle is one of the reasons we're trapped in this like Instagram influencer hellhole that we exist in right now, to put it nicely.
No, absolutely. And I guess in the sort of travel photography industry, what are the guidelines on like post processing and editing and things like that? Or are there not guidelines? Is that something that each person sets themselves?
Well, this is not journalism. So basically, the sky is the limit, and skies are often well below the limit because people Photoshop fake skies in all the freaking time, unfortunately. Yeah, there's no limitations. There's no like journalistic integrity editor looking over your shoulder. You can Photoshop whatever you want. People do that all the time, both in the influencer industry and beyond. And so this irks me a lot just because, I mean, like I said earlier, people photoshopping out all the people in their photos or adding beautiful skies in places that are typically gray. People remove things from their photos all the time to kind of add to the dramatic effect. And this is not just influencers. This is also people as high up as Steve McCurry. And so sorry if you're listening to this. But yeah, I mean, there are no limitations. And that's both the beauty and the horror of the internet, that anything is possible and you can represent a place in any way you want. And so personally, I mean, I also go overboard with post-processing sometimes. I'm like addicted to rainbows, to put it in a very eloquent way. And so sure, I go over the top with saturation sometimes. But I think that considering how widespread filters and these kinds of things are at this point, people at least do have an understanding of how much a photo can be edited versus before, when not everyone was armed with tiny little supercomputers in their pockets. So I think that there's better understanding of how much a photo can be altered. And so this I don't worry about as much unless we're talking a journalism situation or something where it could be legitimately dangerous for people to feel like they could be in this situation and replicate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that dangerous bit is such an important point, because I think you get that. I mean, there are often like those headlines in the news about how, people have actually died trying to replicate, quite dramatic photographs and things for social media, which is quite upsetting, really. I've also seen things in the news about, when a certain location gets really popular on social media, it can actually bring a lot of like destruction to that place. I think it was specifically like there was a situation with lavender fields, and then people were trampling through the lavender fields and destroying the thing that they had gone there to photograph. And I guess I was just wondering, how do you work against that? Or is that something that you incorporate as part of the education that you're really promoting as an influencer on your platform?
Sure. I've had the same experience. I'm here in Belgium right now, and in Belgium there's the bluebell forest that comes and blooms every March or April. And it's a really big issue because people come, and once you trample on these flowers, they're not going to grow back like ever. So they're actually like extremely vulnerable. And so in that case, I shared my photos and just made sure that if I was in the photo, I wasn't anywhere close to the flowers. And I also included like the written description, like, by the way, don't walk on these because they will be ruined forever. And it's our responsibility, if we want to enjoy these in the future, to not do these things. But obviously that's only going to reach a certain group of people who bother to read these things. I think that the most powerful thing that we can do is just stop centering photos where we are in these situations, where we are the center of the photos, because I think that's where a lot of the issues come from now, is that we're all trying to get the Instagram shot, the beautiful girl in the beautiful location, but like smack in the middle of the beautiful location. And so you have all these people descending and swarming and trampling and just taking over, not so much to appreciate the beauty, but more to have someone document them in the beauty. And so I think that if we kind of took our step back and just reverted to actually looking at the things that we're theoretically coming to appreciate, I think that would remove a lot of the damage and also just lighten up the situation a bit, because no one wants to watch like thousands of aspiring influencers come and trample on their property. And so, yeah, I think just anyone who's in the position to influence how people think about these things should start promoting just beauty for the sake of beauty rather than me in that space, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about it like that. I'd thought about that maybe when it comes to like sort of international development work and, the white saviorism that happens a lot of times in photographs taken in development contexts where, a white person will center themselves in the photograph and the people around them become sort of props for that, but they're very much using it as a way of saying something about themselves. And it's interesting because I hadn't thought about that in terms of like influencers and beautiful landscapes, but there is something happening there as well about how people are interacting with a space and making it about them when the bluebells really aren't about them.
I mean, it's the same kind of basic principle there, right? Because when people are doing that, they're making it all about them in this space, doing this thing, and you need people to step back and just appreciate beauty because it looks nice. Surprise! Just in the same way that when people are doing international work, it shouldn't be about this white savior coming in and helping the people. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to help other people, but people should be doing it for the sake of uplifting others with the privileges that they have, not so that other people will come and just kiss their feet because of what they've been doing. It's about not centering yourself, but rather the work that you are doing.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. What does photography ethics mean to you?
Ethics to me is about making sure that what I'm producing is not harming people. And that can come in a variety of forms, like perpetuating harmful negative stereotypes is one, putting people at risk of danger or otherwise is another, not exploiting people is a kind of harm, not destroying a location, maybe like we were talking about with revealing it to too many people could sometimes come into play. Just when I create an image and I share that image, I would hope that it has a net positive effect on the world and not just like my own ego, not just other people's egos. Like it actually benefits whatever situation I'm sharing in that image. So that is what ethics means to me.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. Join me next week when we hear from Toby Smith on climate visuals. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics. This podcast was edited and digitally produced by Ellie Gascoigne.